The theme of sexual ambiguity has always run through Blake Edwards' work. Whether you're talking about his film Victor Victoria or the movie Switch with Ellen Barkin that he was promoting when he appeared on this episode of Later with Bob Costas, April 30th, 1991. Edwards talks at length about his fascination with the topic and how he tried to increase people's awareness and openness by putting the message into a comedic work so that it was palatable and logical, not shove it in your face. But those were different times, as Lou Reed would say. He might have shoved it in your face. Edwards also talks about Days of Wine and Roses and how a working woman who was friends with Jack Warner kept the film's original ending intact. The power of, oh, we can't say that word. It's not ambiguous enough, but you get the drift. Thank goodness for the power of, you get the drift. Or we would see a really screwed up version of Days in White and Roses. If you haven't seen that movie, check that one out. And Edwards also talks about Inspector Clouseau, Peter Sellers, and the Pink Panther movies and the making of them and the complex person that Peter Sellers was. This is a great interview with Blake Edwards. Mr. Julie Andrews. I think it really fits into the times we're in now. Everyone will like this interview. Well, not everyone. There's no ambiguity here.
Thanks for staying up later. Blake Edwards is with us. His films over the years have grossed better than $1 billion. He directed, wrote, produced the entire Pink Panther series, and Breakfast at Tiffany's, Days of Wine and Roses, 10, Victor Victoria, those are all his films. And later this month, Switch will be released, starring Ellen Barkin, and you can tell us more about it, but just as a brief sketch, this is a guy, something of a male chauvinist, who dies, and in a weird switch comes back, same personality, same brain, in the body of a woman. Is it just coincidence that this is another sexual ambiguity, sexual identity theme as Victor Victoria was, or is this something that's of particular interest to you?
It's not a coincidence. I began thinking about it actually while I was doing Victor Victoria. And it sort of just stayed with me, and then it was irresistible, and I began to play with it a little and eventually to write it.
Irresistible because it's a great comedic premise, or because you think it's something that of more serious value that needs to be said and comedy's just the vehicle?
Well, actually, by irresistible, I sort of deal with that word not as whether or not something is good or bad or has merit, but because it seems to hang around with me. I'm not sure what that process is, but it stays with me and eventually becomes so irresistible, it keeps knocking on me, that I have to turn my attention to it and try to develop it and to write it. I guess that part of the reason that it is irresistible is because maybe I feel that it has merit or that it needs investigation, so I give into it.
Ellen Barkin seems to think that despite her obvious sexual appeal, there's a certain mannish quality about her, too, a tomboy quality. Was that something you saw in her?
Oh, yeah, very definitely. I always felt from the beginning when I started thinking about who would be right for this, and that was as I began to write it almost, that she would be great, because I always sensed that she was in touch with that masculine side of herself more than most women. But along with it is this very bright lady. This just isn't kind of some intuitive thing she does. It encompasses a considerable brain in there. Boy, I've had some talks with her, and she's floored me a couple of times with her sense of what's really going on. And her balance in that world.
Victor Victoria was tremendously well received critically. And on paper, I think probably some people were skeptical before they saw the film. Maybe they thought the premise was too broad and it wouldn't connect. But it did, with your wife, Julie Andrews, as a woman who, in order to discover her own sexuality and get in touch with herself, has to pretend that she's a man impersonating a woman.
Well, actually, you know, that premise was made in Germany, in France, I believe, and in England, called in Germany Victor und Victoria or something like that. And I saw the original film. It was presented to me as an idea to, well, let's make this. And I was suddenly very interested in that because it was so convoluted, and it, you know, it really made me interested. And then I invented the Toddy character, who was her homosexual friend, and brought that element into it, which made it even more convoluted. It was just a kind of fun puzzle, and role-playing and genders have always interested me anyway, so that sort of seemed to be the ultimate.
You said in a Playboy interview some years ago that there's almost always a message in what you do, but you just find that people don't like to be the objects of a sermon, and so the best vehicle, at least for your talent, you found, is to slip the message into a comedic premise.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it's you should forgive the expression, a spoonful of sugar. It's easier getting it down that way.
Even a film like Days of Wine and Roses, which is obviously a very powerful drama, in Jack Lemmon, you have a man capable of high comedy and of the most serious dramatic portrayals, and the beginning of the movie is very high-spirited and has a lot of laughs in it. So even there, you kind of ease into it. You don't come out with the sledgehammer.
That's why Jack wanted me to do that film. He was the one that really made it happen. When I understand, when I was proposed as to be the director, everybody said, well, no, but you know, he directs mostly comedy, and yeah, he's done one or two serious things, but, and Jack said, no, you don't understand. It's very important for this to be real, to show the lighter side of the character, some humor in the situations, because life is like that. And fortunately, he prevailed, and I got the job.
The scene, I guess, which everybody remembers, is after he's gone out to the greenhouse and he can't find the bottle, and he throws all the plants off the shelves and everything. He winds up in what today would be called a detox center, I guess, and he's got the straitjacket on.
I remember that that after, on the last camera angle, when he was really going and writhing in that straitjacket, and I said to him, okay, Jack, cut, and he couldn't stop. He was really swept up into it. We had to go in and physically get him out of that straitjacket. He could not stop himself. He'd just gone over the top somewhere into some world that he wasn't quite sure of. And I think that's why it was so powerful, because he was able to really go that distance.
I watched it again the other day, and I thought the closing sequence was very effective because it made it clear, something we all understand now, but which people probably didn't, for the most part, understand then. You never really beat it, and you're never really sure. You go day to day. He's framed with that flashing reflection against the window, the constant thought that he's going to have to fight every single day. It made that point very effectively.
We had a big problem with Jack Warner, because he didn't want that ending. He wanted a happy ending. She got all right, he got all right. And when it came time to run the film for Warner, we went to his private projection room, and Marty Manulis produced the film and was really terrified of Warner maybe changing his film, and we begged Marty not to to say anything and to be more or less benign through all of this process and wait until the film was over, and then we'd fight that battle, and we could. And sure enough, the film was over, and Warner, who showed up with a very attractive lady, stood up and said, well, you're going to have to change that film. You're going to have to change that ending. And I could see poor Marty slumped down in his chair, and I saw Jack go, oh, God. And I was about to open my mouth, and this lady said, why? I think that's a very honest ending. And he said, who asked you? And she said, well, you asked me. You asked me to come here and sit in here and watch your movie. And I believe that's real. That's what life is. The other's Hollywood crap. Well, he turned beet red, and as a consequence of that, we got our ending. And I found out years later that she was a well-known lady around town who was, well, I guess a good word would be courtesan. And so we owe our ending of that film to that lady, and I thank her wherever she is, whoever she is.
Okay, on now to the Pink Panther. Without Henry Mancini's theme song, which everybody from age 3 to 103 knows, even with the quality of the scripts and Peter Sellers' talent and your direction and whatever else, how popular do you imagine it would have been without that signature?
Well, that's an impossible question to answer. I mean, Hank's contribution was enormous, no doubt about it. I really wouldn't have any way of knowing. I think it would have been popular in spite of Hank, but I think Hank probably gave it a longevity, you know, that it wouldn't have had.
Peter Ustinov was originally in line for the role, true?
He was not only in line, he was in the role. He was cast as Clouseau and in Italy, and it was literally like the Friday night before the Monday that we were supposed to start shooting that he backed out.
Why?
Oh, he had a lot of reasons. As I recall, one of the reasons was that he had understood that Ava Gardner was supposed to play in it, and now she wasn't. She'd been replaced with Capucine, and there's several things like that. I think that may have been the foremost reason. I don't recall that well.
So then Peter Sellers shows up almost literally on the eve of shooting.
Oh, yeah. Yes. We got in a panic, obviously. There was no way we could talk Mr. Ustinov out of it. And Sellers was suggested because suddenly there was a window in his schedule. Said, if you can do it in X amount of weeks, we can get Sellers. And I said, I only remember him in, I think it was I'm All Right, Jack. And I said, I don't really see him that much, but I know he's good. Okay, let's get him. So he flew in immediately, and I met him at the airport, and by the time we'd gotten home from the Rome airport, we discovered that we had a great affinity for the early comedians, and we decided to shift the character around enough so that it would have an originality that Peter could say it was his own. And that Clouseau was born.
When something becomes a classic like that, it's impossible to imagine anybody else doing it. It seems as if it wasn't even a role that was crafted. It seems as if he fell out of bed and he was just the right guy to do it.
Well, that's the way it seems. It was crafted, and in that ride was the genesis of that character. And then from the first one to the last one, that character grew and was refined, and it wasn't until we did Shot in the Dark that the odd speech characteristic that Clouseau had came to be. He'd gone to Paris and came back and said, I ran into this concierge and he spoke like this, and he did it. And I said, great. And so that was not in the original Panther.
But then as the series continued,
Yeah.
he became more and more detached, and that
Yes.
presented certain problems that you had to work around, right?
Yeah, yeah, it got tougher and tougher.
In what ways?
Well, he was not well at all. You know, he had a serious heart attack, a series of heart attacks, and he didn't take care of himself. He, you know, alcohol, drugs, and pushed himself too much, and he just began to deteriorate. Right before your eyes, you could see it happening, and he lost his sense of timing. He even voiced it one day. He said, I think I've had so many heart attacks, I'm burned out. You know, I think I've burned out some of those things in my head. And it just got worse and worse.
You had to shoot some things with doubles that
Yeah.
in the early days he would have been able to do himself, right?
Right. Well, even in the early days, we did a lot of doubling. A stuntman named Joe Dunn doubled him, and actually Joe could walk through there now and you'd swear it was Sellers. He was able to take on the character. But that's true. As he got along, as we went into the latter films, he really couldn't do the physical stuff and remember his lines at the same time. It was very hard. And there was the emotional side of Peter, too. I mean, Peter was a deeply disturbed human being. I mean, there were times when he was fun and it was great. There were times when it was awful, you know. And I think Peter was, if not a borderline, he was probably could be classified a paranoid schizophrenic, as close to it as you could come without being that, maybe. I think he probably was.
So there might have been a lovable and sympathetic aspect to that, and always admiration for the talent. But I would imagine that as you're just trying to get work done day to day, you wanted to haul off and belt him.
Well, it was feast or famine with him. I likened it to Chaplin in City Lights. You know, when the drunk picks him up and befriends him and takes him into the home, and Chaplin, this is great, and the next morning the guy's sober and throws him out.
Your affinity for those old comic actors, even going back to the silent film days of Charlie Chaplin, or I guess Stan Laurel kind of straddles the line, pre and post talkies. You can see it in a lot of your work. In fact, you did a movie, The Great Race, which was essentially about those actors of days gone by. And in 10, there's a lot of physical stuff. He's scrambling up the hill and he's sliding back down. He's jumping in and out of bed. He's got his shoes off or his shoes on. All these goofy situations that you just seem to love to milk for all they're worth.
Yep, I do. I think they're fun for me. They make me smile and please me a lot.
How comfortable are you with being really an icon of motion pictures, but with the discomfort that you have with some of the stuff that surrounds it?
Well, I'm more comfortable now as I get older and survive, I guess. Mort Saul said to me one time that survival was the best revenge. So I'm more comfortable with it, but I'm not entirely comfortable, and I never will be.
Even with all the success you've had, how devastating is it to have a flop, to have a Darling Lily or a What Did You Do in the War, Daddy, that you have great hopes for and it goes down the drain?
It's devastating. It's particularly devastating if you believe in your heart that one of the reasons for the flop, one of the reasons it flopped was because of interference by people that you didn't feel had the credentials, were necessarily qualified to make those decisions that influenced the product enough to maybe make it flop. What Did You Do in the War, Daddy? I take all the credit for that flop. That was nobody's fault. Darling Lily, I blame a great deal on the people that were in charge in those days, and that I wrote about in S.O.B. And And somehow that hurts even more when you get rewritten like that. That's happened to me on several occasions, and I've had big battles, and I don't know whether the battles have ever done that much good, but I couldn't help but fight for it. And when you've done something that you really think maybe is one of your better efforts, and see it spoiled, that is devastating. Really hurts.
Accommodations furnished by the Universal City Hilton and Towers. Make your next stay in Los Angeles a memorable one with our spacious rooms, international cuisine, and the attention of a friendly, experienced staff.
Sorry, 50s fans, discussions of Richard Diamond and Peter Gunn, which Blake Edwards was also involved in, I'll have to wait for another time if he comes back sometime in the future. Meanwhile, later this month, Switch, starring Ellen Barkin, Blake Edwards' 48th film, comes out, and we're out of here just for a little while. In fact, for 24 hours. See you later.